A millionaire hired a mute cleaning lady to humiliate her every day. One day, while he was ridiculing her in the mansion's hallway, she stopped, dropped the broom, and said 3 words that made him tremble. Eleanor carefully arranged the petals of a yellow rose while watching her father work in the garden of the immense Mendonça mansion, her small hands imitating the precise gestures that Josiah made with the larger plants. The morning sun bathed the garden in golden tones, creating dancing shadows among the foliage that her father had cultivated with such care for 15 years. She wore a light blue dress that her grandmother had sewn especially for her, with small white flowers embroidered on the hem, and her brown hair was tied in 2 little braids that swung with each movement. Josiah worked with his usual dedication, his calloused hands moving the pruning shears with the experience of someone who knew every branch, every thorn, every secret of those rose bushes that he himself had planted when he began working there. Eleanor loved these moments with her father, when he let her accompany him to work during school holidays, teaching her about plants and telling stories about every corner of that magnificent garden. "Daddy, this rose is beautiful," she said with her sweet, melodious little voice. Josiah paused his work for a moment and looked at his daughter with a smile that lit up his tired face. The gardener approached little Eleanor and crouched beside her, his simple work clothes stained with fresh soil and morning dew. He gently touched the rose that his daughter was admiring, his thick fingers surprisingly delicate when handling the fragile petals. Eleanor could smell the scent of earth and plants that always accompanied her father, an aroma that for her meant security and love. Josiah was 42 years old, but looked older due to hard work under the sun, with deep wrinkles around his eyes that became more pronounced when he smiled at his only daughter. His hair already showed some grey strands at the temples, and his back carried the curvature of years dedicated to caring for that garden that was his pride. Eleanor hugged him suddenly, her little arms barely able to embrace his broad shoulders, and Josiah held her against his chest carefully so as not to dirty her pretty dress. "You know, my princess, every rose has its own personality, just like people," he explained with infinite patience. Eleanor nodded, her brown eyes shining with curiosity and admiration for her father. Eleanor ran toward the marble fountain that stood in the center of the garden, her bare little feet making soft noises on the perfectly trimmed grass. The fountain was her favorite part of the entire garden, with its golden carp swimming lazily and the constant sound of falling water creating a natural melody that calmed her. She sat on the stone edge and began to hum softly the song that Josiah always sang to make her sleep, an old song about a little bird that flew freely through the skies. Josiah continued his work on the rose bushes, but his ears were always attentive to his daughter, a protective father's habit that never completely relaxed even in that seemingly safe environment. The Mendonça mansion garden was truly impressive, with its geometrically perfect flower beds, its trees pruned with artistic precision, and its flowers that seemed to compete with each other in beauty and fragrance. Eleanor wet her little fingers in the cool water of the fountain and watched the ripples spread, momentarily disturbing the mirrored surface. "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to take care of beautiful gardens like you," she declared suddenly. Josiah felt his heart warm with his daughter's innocent comment. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stones of the main path made Josiah instinctively raise his head, recognizing Harrison Mendonça's characteristic walk even before seeing him appear on the mansion's veranda. Eleanor also noticed the change in the atmosphere and stopped humming, observing how her father's body became slightly tenser, his hands gripping the pruning shears a little tighter. Harrison Mendonça was an imposing man at 55 years old, always dressed in expensive suits that seemed never to wrinkle, his hair perfectly combed back with imported gel that shone under the sun. His face normally carried a poorly disguised expression of superiority, as if the whole world owed him something, but that morning there was something different about his appearance. Eleanor immediately noticed that her father's employer's face was as red as a ripe tomato, the veins in his neck bulging and visibly pulsing even from a distance. Josiah automatically positioned himself between his daughter and the house, a protective gesture that he made without even realizing it, while continuing to prune the rose bushes as if nothing was happening. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," he greeted respectfully. But Harrison did not respond to the greeting, his eyes scanning the garden like a predator looking for its prey. Harrison descended the marble steps of the veranda, with quick and heavy steps that echoed through the silent garden, his face growing even redder with each passing second. Eleanor instinctively shrank behind the fountain, something in her little heart telling her that this man was very, very angry about something. Josiah carefully put down the pruning shears on the ground and wiped his hands on his gardening apron, mentally preparing himself for whatever was to come. Harrison stopped a few meters away, his breathing heavy and irregular, as if he had run a marathon, fists clenched at his side, trembling with barely contained rage. Eleanor could see small drops of sweat running down the rich man's forehead, staining the impeccable collar of his imported white shirt. The silence stretched for a few seconds that seemed like hours, only the sound of the fountain water breaking the growing tension in the air. "My safe has been robbed!" Harrison finally exploded, his shrill voice making birds take flight from nearby trees. Eleanor was startled by the sudden shout and ran close to her father, clinging to his leg. Josiah stood paralyzed for a moment, processing the words he had just heard, his mind trying to understand why Harrison was telling him this with so much anger directed specifically at him. Eleanor felt her father's body go rigid like a statue, his muscles tense under the thin fabric of his work shirt, worn from constant use. Harrison took another step forward, invading Josiah's personal space in a clearly threatening manner, his hot breath sour with strong coffee hitting the gardener's face. Josiah's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a growing sense of injustice that was beginning to form in his chest like a hot iron ball. Eleanor squeezed her father's leg even tighter, her little eyes filling with tears without her understanding exactly why, just feeling that something very bad was about to happen. The entire garden seemed to have stopped breathing. Even the wind ceased to shake the leaves, as if nature also sensed the approaching tragedy. "All the money I kept at home disappeared during the night," Harrison continued, his voice laden with accusation. Josiah swallowed hard, beginning to understand where this conversation was going and his boss's plans. The accusation came like a punch to Josiah's stomach, Harrison's words cutting through the air like sharp blades that tore not only at his dignity, but 15 years of honest and dedicated work. Eleanor didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could feel the tremor running through her father's body, could see his hands closing and opening repeatedly as if he were trying to grasp something invisible in the air. Harrison pointed his index finger directly at Josiah's face, the gesture loaded with an absolute certainty that admitted no question or defense. The sun that had previously seemed welcoming now burned mercilessly, casting harsh and cruel shadows on the boss's face, contorted with rage. Josiah took a step back, not out of cowardice, but to protect Eleanor, who was still clinging to him, trying to process the gravity of what was being said. The rose bushes he had cared for with such affection seemed like silent witnesses to this injustice, their perfect petals contrasting with the ugliness of the situation unfolding. "It was you, Josiah. Only you knew about the safe," Harrison accused with absolute conviction. Eleanor felt her father shudder as if he had been slapped in the face. The words of denial came out of Josiah's mouth like a desperate torrent, each syllable charged with the urgency of an innocent man trying to defend not only his honor, but his very life. Eleanor watched her father's face contort into an expression of incredulity and despair that she had never seen before, his normally calm and gentle features now marked by growing panic. Harrison had already taken his cell phone from his jacket pocket, his fat fingers dialing numbers with cruel determination, while his eyes never left Josiah's face. The gardener tried to approach, hands extended in a gesture of supplication, but Harrison stepped back as if Josiah were contagious. Eleanor began to cry softly, tears silently running down her chubby cheeks, as she tried to understand why that bad man was shouting at her father. The sound of the call being completed echoed in the tense silence of the garden, and Josiah felt his world begin to crumble when he heard Harrison speaking to the police. "Mr. Harrison, I would never do this. You know I've worked here for 15 years, Josiah pleaded, his voice breaking. But Harrison had already turned his back, speaking on the phone with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Eleanor watched in horror as Harrison spoke on the phone with a cold and calculated voice, giving the mansion's address and insisting that he already knew who was guilty of the theft. Josiah fell to his knees on the lawn that he himself had mowed the day before. His hands joined in a prayer position as he begged Harrison to reconsider, to at least investigate before calling the police. Little Eleanor ran to her father and hugged him, her small hands trying to comfort him, even without fully understanding the gravity of the situation unfolding before her innocent eyes. The smell of cut grass mixed with the sweet perfume of roses, creating a surreal contrast with the nightmare that was happening in that once peaceful garden. "I've already called the police." "You'll pay dearly for what you did," repeated Harrison with cruel satisfaction. Josiah hugged Eleanor tightly, as if he could protect her from what was to come. The sound of police sirens began faintly in the distance, but grew rapidly, until it became a deafening howl that made Eleanor squeeze her little eyes shut. Josiah rose from the ground with difficulty, his legs trembling as if they were made of jelly, and picked up his daughter, hugging her against his chest as if it were the last time. Eleanor could feel her father's heart beating so hard it seemed like it would explode, and her own little hands clung to his neck with all the strength her little arms allowed. Harrison remained standing on the porch, watching the scene with a coldness that would freeze hell itself, his arms crossed over his chest in the posture of judge and executioner. The mansion gate opened with a metallic creak, and 2 police officers entered quickly, their hands already positioned over the holsters of the handcuffs hanging from their belts. Josiah kissed Eleanor's forehead repeatedly, murmuring words of love and comfort that were lost among contained sobs. "Daddy did nothing wrong, my love. Daddy will come back," he whispered against his daughter's hair. Eleanor nodded, but something inside her screamed that it was a lie. The police officers approached Josiah with determined steps, their serious and professional faces showing no emotion as one of them took the handcuffs from his belt. Eleanor saw the cold metal shine under the sun, and something primitive in her childish brain understood that it meant they were going to take her father away. Josiah gently placed Eleanor on the ground, his hands trembling so much that he almost dropped her, and knelt to be at her height, looking deeply into her brown eyes that were identical to his. The older officer, a corpulent man with a graying mustache, cleared his throat impatiently, but Josiah ignored him, focused only on his daughter. Eleanor touched her father's face with her small hands, feeling the stubble slightly scratch her soft palms, unknowingly memorizing every detail of that beloved face. Harrison descended the porch steps and positioned himself beside the officers, as if he wanted to ensure that his particular justice was executed. "Mr. Josiah Silver, you are being accused of aggravated theft," said the officer in a monotonous voice. Josiah closed his eyes for a moment, a solitary tear running down his face. Eleanor's voice exploded in a desperate cry that echoed throughout the garden and probably beyond the walls of the mansion, a primitive sound of a child about to lose the most important person in her life. Josiah tried to stand up to comfort her, but the officers were already holding his arms, forcing them behind his back while the handcuffs were placed with a sinister metallic click. Eleanor ran toward the officers, her short little legs barely able to keep up with the movement, her arms extended trying to reach her father who was being taken away from her. The younger officer tried to gently prevent her from approaching, but Eleanor dodged and clung to Josiah's legs with all the strength of her 6 years. Harrison watched the scene with an expression of irritation, as if all that drama was an inconvenience in his morning. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to have ceased, as if the garden itself was in mourning for what was happening. "Daddy is innocent. Daddy never steals anything. Please don't take my father," cried Eleanor between sobs. Josiah tried to bend down to hug her, but the handcuffs prevented him. Josiah struggled against the handcuffs not to escape, but to be able to touch his daughter one last time, his eyes overflowing with tears that he could no longer contain. Eleanor clung to his legs as if her life depended on it, and in a way it did, because Josiah was all she had in the world since her mother had died in childbirth. The police officers tried to be gentle, but they had a job to do, and began pulling Josiah toward the gate while Eleanor was dragged along, her bare feet scraping on the gravel path. Harrison followed the group in silence, his presence an evil shadow over the entire scene, ensuring his revenge was complete. Josiah's desperation was palpable, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths as he tried to calm Eleanor with words that came out broken and almost incomprehensible. The sun that had previously shone cheerfully now seemed like a cruel spotlight, illuminating the tragedy unfolding in the garden. "Eleanor, my child, Daddy will come back. Stay calm, my love," shouted Josiah, his voice hoarse. But Eleanor could only scream and cry, clinging to him like a castaway to a life raft. The scene became even more chaotic when Eleanor began to struggle against the police officers who were trying to pull her away from Josiah, her small fists hitting the men's legs without causing any real damage, but demonstrating all the desperation of a child who was being separated from her only protector. Josiah called out to his daughter in desperation, while Harrison remained indifferent to the scene, treating everything as something of no importance. The gardener turned his head back as he was taken away, his eyes searching for Eleanor one last time, trying to engrave in his memory every detail of her little face. The entire garden seemed to spin around them, colors mixing in a blur of green and red. "Eleanor, Eleanor!" Josiah called without stopping. It was then that the unthinkable happened, the moment that would forever change Eleanor's life and seal the fate of everyone involved. Josiah put his hand to his chest, and suddenly his body weakened and he fell to the ground without strength. Eleanor ran to him in panic, while the police officers realized that something terrible was happening. "My God, he's having a heart attack," shouted the younger officer. Eleanor ran to her father, but her legs seemed made of lead. Eleanor realized in that moment that she had lost the person she loved most. The garden, which had always been a place of joy, was now marked by sadness. The garden, once full of life, now seemed silent in the face of tragedy. The younger police officer had run to the car to get the radio and call an ambulance, but everyone there knew it was too late. The garden that minutes before was a place of peace and beauty had now become the scene of its worst tragedy. The rose bushes that Josiah had pruned with such care seemed to bend in mourning, their petals falling gently over the motionless body. Eleanor tried to scream, tried to call for help, tried to make any sound, but her voice had completely disappeared, taken away by trauma. The sound of the ambulance arriving too late echoed through the garden like a lament, the red lights flashing uselessly as paramedics rushed with a stretcher that would no longer be necessary. Eleanor was gently moved aside. The paramedics confirmed what everyone already knew, making notes on clipboards and speaking in medical terms that Eleanor neither understood nor wanted to understand. Harrison finally approached, but not to offer comfort or show remorse, only to give instructions to the police about what to do. Eleanor stared at him with eyes that burned with pure hatred, a feeling so strong and primitive that it would frighten anyone who could see beyond the appearance of a destroyed child. She tried to scream at him, accuse him, curse him, but her voice remained trapped somewhere deep inside. "What a tragedy," Harrison commented with false compassion. Eleanor memorized every line of that cruel face. A social worker arrived with the ambulance, a middle-aged woman with glasses and a face that tried to appear kind, but only managed to look tired. Eleanor was informed that she would be taken to a temporary shelter until they found a relative who could take care of her. But Eleanor knew there was no one. Josiah was a widower. His parents had died years ago, and there were no uncles or aunts who could take her in. The woman tried to talk to Eleanor, ask simple questions, but when she realized the girl couldn't speak, she wrongly assumed she was disabled. Eleanor wanted to explain that she wasn't mute, that she had lost her voice watching her father die, but the words simply wouldn't come out. She was led toward the social worker's car, each step taking her further from her father. "Poor little thing, she's traumatized," said the social worker. Eleanor was placed in the back seat of the Child Welfare Council's car, the seatbelt too tight on her chest that was still trying to catch its breath between silent sobs. Through the window, she could see the rose bushes seeming to cry due even under the strong sun, as if nature too was mourning the loss of its most dedicated caretaker. The social worker got into the car and began to drive, constantly talking in what seemed to be an attempt to comfort Eleanor, but her words were just background noise. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the mansion she was leaving behind, engraving every detail in her childish memory that had somehow become adult in those terrible minutes. Harrison was still on the porch, now talking on the phone again, probably already looking for a new gardener. "We're going to a safe place, dear," said the social worker. Eleanor didn't answer, couldn't answer, but in her mind a single word echoed: revenge. The car passed through the mansion gates, and Eleanor had her last view of the place where her life had been destroyed. Harrison was giving orders to the police officers, gesturing impatiently, as if losing Josiah was just an inconvenience in his day. She could see the mansion staff watching from a distance, some with expressions of shock, others with fear of being next. The garden remained beautiful and perfectly maintained, indifferent to the tragedy it had witnessed, the flowers continuing to bloom as if nothing had happened. Eleanor pressed her small hand against the cold glass of the car, leaving the mark of her fingers on the surface, as if she could somehow reach through the glass and change what had happened. The social worker looked in the rearview mirror and saw the gesture, misinterpreting it as a childish goodbye. Eleanor wasn't saying goodbye. She was making a silent promise that one day she would return. "Clean up this mess from my garden. And hire another gardener," Harrison's words echoed in her mind. Eleanor closed her eyes, but the image of her father remained engraved on her eyelids. Eleanor kept her eyes closed as the car drove away, and in her childish mind that had been forced to mature in a matter of minutes, a promise began to form with the clarity of an oath. She would return to that mansion, no matter how long it took, no matter what she needed to do or who she needed to become to succeed. Harrison Mendonça would pay for every tear she was shedding, for every moment of despair her father had felt, for every unjust accusation he had shouted. Eleanor could feel something changing inside her, as if the happy girl who sang in the garden was leaving along with Josiah, replaced by someone who didn't yet have a name or form, but who had a single purpose. Her little hands closed into fists so tight that her small nails left marks on her palms, a physical pain that was nothing compared to the pain in her heart. The social worker continued talking about the shelter and how everything would be all right, but Eleanor wasn't listening, lost in a silent oath that echoed in her voiceless mind. "I will come back, Mr. Harrison, and when I do, you will know what it is to lose everything," she promised in thought. The car turned a corner, and the mansion disappeared from view, but the promise remained, engraved in iron and fire in her soul. Eleanor stood before the iron gates of the Mendonça mansion, 24 years after that terrible day that had changed her life forever. The cold metal under her fingers had the same rough texture she remembered from when she was a child, but now her hands were larger, stronger, marked by hard work and years of preparation. The garden she could see through the bars was unrecognizable. The rose bushes that Josiah had cultivated with so much love now grew wild and disorganized, the flower beds invaded by weeds, the grass tall and yellowed in some places. Eleanor took a deep breath, the air carrying the smell of neglect and abandonment that had taken over the place where her father had dedicated 15 years of his life. She adjusted the simple grey dress she had carefully chosen to look humble but presentable, her now long hair tied in a tight bun that made her look older and more serious. The morning sun was in the same position as that fateful day, creating the same shadows she remembered, as if time had stopped waiting for her return. Eleanor touched the worn bag where she kept the falsified documents she had meticulously prepared over the years, every detail designed to create the perfect identity of Clara Silva, a mute woman desperate for work. "Today is when my real life begins," she thought, pressing the doorbell. Her heart was beating hard, but not from fear, rather from anticipation. The sound of approaching footsteps made Eleanor straighten her posture and lower her eyes, assuming the submissive persona she had practiced thousands of times in front of the mirror. The heavy wooden door opened with a creak that echoed through the abandoned garden, and there he was, Harrison Mendonça, 24 years older but still recognizable. His once perfectly combed hair was now thin and grey, combed back in a pathetic attempt to hide his advanced baldness. His face was marked by deep wrinkles of bitterness, small cruel eyes sunk into bags of flabby skin that betrayed sleepless nights and probably too much alcohol. He wore a navy blue silk robe that had seen better days, stained in some parts and faded in others. Eleanor noticed that his hands trembled slightly, an almost imperceptible tremor that could be age or perhaps guilt, though she doubted Harrison knew that feeling. The smell of coffee and cigarettes emanated from him like a toxic cloud, mixed with an expensive perfume that failed to mask the odor of decay. "You must be the cleaning lady applicant. Come in," he said in a hoarse voice. Eleanor nodded silently and crossed the threshold, stepping for the first time in 24 years into the place where her father had been unjustly accused. The interior of the mansion was as decadent as the garden, with dust-covered furniture, heavy curtains that blocked most of the natural light, and a stale air that suggested the windows hadn't been opened for months. Eleanor followed Harrison through the main corridor, the same one where Josiah had been handcuffed, and had to control every muscle in her body not to show the wave of memories that hit her. The marble floor that once gleamed was now dull and stained, with scratches and marks that no previous cleaner had managed or bothered to clean. The walls displayed crooked and faded paintings, family portraits that seemed to watch with disapproval the decline of the house. Harrison walked with heavy steps, occasionally leaning against the wall as if he needed support, and Eleanor noticed that he had gained considerable weight, his prominent belly stretching the fabric of his robe. The silence between them was broken only by the ticking of an old clock and the dragging of Harrison's slippers on the dirty floor. When they reached the office, Eleanor had to suppress a gasp of surprise at the chaotic state of the room, with papers scattered everywhere, empty bottles on the desk, and a sour smell of old food. "Sit down," Harrison ordered, throwing himself heavily into his leather armchair. Eleanor obeyed, keeping her expression neutral while her mind catalogued every detail of the environment. Harrison picked up the resume Eleanor had sent through the agency, his fat, nicotine-stained fingers holding the paper with evident disdain. He read it briefly, occasionally making sounds of disapproval with his tongue, as if each line confirmed his worst suspicions about the working class. Eleanor kept her hands crossed in her lap, the perfect image of submission and desperation that she had cultivated for this moment. The office had a large window overlooking the destroyed garden, and Eleanor could see the exact spot where Josiah had fallen, now covered by tall weeds. Harrison finally raised his eyes from the paper, studying Eleanor, as if she were a defective product he was considering buying at a discount. His eyes scanned her face, her body, her simple clothes, and in each observation there was a silent and cruel judgment. Eleanor recognized the same look he had given Josiah moments before accusing him, that mixture of superiority and contempt that seemed to be his default expression. "I see your name is Clara Silver." "What a generic name," he commented sarcastically. Eleanor didn't react, keeping her eyes downcast as she had practiced, letting him savor his moment of power. The silence stretched for long seconds as Harrison continued to examine Eleanor, clearly expecting some kind of reaction to his insulting comment, but she remained still as a statue. Frustrated with the lack of response, he leaned forward, the movement making the armchair creak under his weight, and his eyes narrowed with renewed interest. Eleanor could feel his gaze as something physical on her skin, invasive and unpleasant, but she had been through worse things in shelters and orphanages over the years. The sunlight that came through the dirty window created an ironic halo around Harrison's head, as if nature were mocking the idea that he could have any kind of sanctity. She noticed there were dusty photographs on the desk, turned so that she couldn't see them, but from the elaborate golden frame, they were probably of his deceased wife. The clock in the corner of the office read 9 in the morning, the same time Josiah had been arrested all those years ago, a coincidence that Eleanor chose to interpret as a sign. "The agency mentioned you're mute, is that true?" Harrison suddenly asked, his voice laden with a morbid curiosity. Eleanor raised her eyes briefly, just enough to establish eye contact, and slowly nodded her head. Eleanor reached for her purse with deliberately slow and careful movements, not wanting to appear too confident or independent. She took out the falsified medical certificate she had obtained through questionable contacts she had made over the years, a document that seemed perfectly legitimate and attested to her condition of traumatic muteness. Harrison took the paper with his fingertips, as if fearing contamination by poverty, and read with surprising attention for someone who seemed so careless in other aspects. Eleanor observed how his lips moved slightly as he read, a childish habit that contrasted with his pose of superiority. The certificate explained that she had lost her voice due to childhood trauma, without giving many details, leaving room for interpretation. Harrison folded the paper and placed it on the desk, a smile beginning to form on his thin, dried lips. It was the kind of smile a cat would give upon finding an injured mouse, full of cruel anticipation. Eleanor recognized that smile. It was the same one he had given before calling the police on Josiah. Perfect. A maid who can't gossip, complain, or contradict me. That's exactly what I'm looking for, he said with evident satisfaction. Eleanor maintained a neutral expression, but inside her determination grew even stronger. Harrison rose from the armchair with some difficulty, his weight and age making the movement less graceful than he probably intended. He began to circle around the chair where Eleanor was sitting, his steps creating a threatening rhythm that echoed through the silent office. Eleanor could feel the heat of his body when he passed behind her, the smell of sweat, poorly disguised by expensive cologne, invading her nostrils. She kept her eyes fixed on a point on the wall, not following his movements, demonstrating the passivity he clearly expected. Harrison stopped directly behind her, close enough that she could hear his heavy breathing, and Eleanor had to fight against the instinct to move away. He was testing her limits, checking how submissive she really was, how far he could push her without resistance. Eleanor had observed predators like him in shelters, men who fed on others' vulnerability, and she knew exactly how to play the role of the perfect prey. The heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light, creating an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to squeeze the air from her lungs. The salary is miserable, hard work, no days off in the first months. Still interested? Harrison asked, stopping in front of her. Eleanor raised her eyes and nodded firmly, letting a trace of feigned desperation show in her expression. Harrison's laughter exploded in the office like the bark of a rabid dog, a harsh sound without genuine joy that made the hair on Eleanor's neck stand on end. He leaned against the desk, his body shaking with cruel laughter, and Eleanor could see tears forming in the corners of his eyes, not from joy, but from the effort of showing so much disdain. The sound continued for too long, transforming into something uncomfortable and almost manic, as if Harrison were laughing at a private joke that only he understood. Eleanor remained seated, her hands still crossed in her lap, watching him with the patience of a spider waiting for its prey to become further entangled in the web. When the laughter finally ceased, Harrison wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving a damp stain on the sleeve of his robe. He stared at her with eyes that gleamed with pure malice, as if he had just discovered a new toy to torture. The clock continued its constant ticking, marking the seconds of this macabre dance between predator and what he believed to be prey. Pathetic, accepting anything for money. That's why you people never escape poverty. He spat the words. Eleanor lowered her head in apparent shame, hiding the gleam of satisfaction in her eyes as he had completely taken the bait. Harrison walked to the office door and made an impatient gesture for Eleanor to follow him, clearly eager to begin his routine of humiliation. Eleanor rose gracefully, picked up her purse and followed him, maintaining a respectful distance while memorizing every detail of the way. The hallway walls displayed marks from removed frames, leaving lighter rectangles on the dingy paint, like ghosts of better times. The floor creaked under Harrison's heavy footsteps, and Eleanor noticed that several boards were loose, creating small traps for those unfamiliar with the path. They passed several closed doors, rooms that probably hadn't been opened for months or years, keeping their dusty secrets. Eleanor recognized a particular door, the old guest room where Josiah sometimes stored his tools when it rained, and had to control the wave of nostalgia that threatened to break her facade. Harrison stopped abruptly in the main hallway, exactly at the point where Josiah had been trapped, and Eleanor almost collided with his back. "We'll start here," he announced, turning to face her. Eleanor nodded, fighting against the memories that threatened to suffocate her in that specific place. The mansion's main hallway was a testament to what money without care could become, with its Italian marble floor that had cost a fortune now stained and dull. Eleanor watched Harrison move through the space with the familiarity of someone who had spent decades there, but without any affection or care for the environment. He stopped near a side table where there was a tray with a coffee service that seemed to have been left there since the day before, the gold-rimmed cups stained with dried coffee marks. The crystal chandelier above them was covered in cobwebs, some pendants missing, others hanging precariously as if they might fall at any moment. Eleanor mentally calculated how long it would take to properly clean just that hallway, and understood why so many housekeepers had given up. Harrison picked up one of the dirty cups, still with cold coffee dregs at the bottom, and held it as if it were a weapon. Eleanor observed his movements, already anticipating what would come next, mentally preparing herself for the humiliation she knew was inevitable. The tall windows of the hallway let in rays of light that illuminated dust particles floating in the air like small dancing ghosts. "This marble floor needs to shine like a mirror," Harrison declared with authority. Eleanor nodded obediently, already calculating her first move in the chess game that had begun. Harrison held the coffee cup over the white marble floor, his eyes fixed on Eleanor with a predatory intensity that she recognized from the bullies at the orphanage. Eleanor kept her expression neutral, but inside she was cataloging his every micro-expression, every nervous tick, every sign of weakness she could exploit in the future. The coffee in the cup was rancid, an oily film floating on the surface, and the sour smell reached where Eleanor was standing. Harrison tilted the cup slowly, savoring the moment, prolonging the anticipation of the humiliation he was about to inflict. Eleanor could see her distorted reflection in the surface of the stained marble, a ghostly version of herself that seemed trapped under the floor. The silence in the hallway was absolute, except for Harrison's heavy breathing and the distant ticking of the office clock. Then, with a deliberate movement and looking directly into Eleanor's eyes, he turned the cup completely. "Oops! How clumsy of me," he said with false innocence. The coffee spread across the marble in an irregular pattern, like dark blood staining the deteriorated purity of the stone. Eleanor watched the coffee spread across the marble, forming small dark rivers that followed the almost invisible imperfections of the floor. Harrison threw the empty cup on the table with a clink that echoed through the hallway and crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for her reaction. Eleanor moved slowly toward what appeared to be a cleaning closet in the corner of the hallway, her steps measured and careful to demonstrate neither haste nor reluctance. Inside the closet, she found old cleaning products and dingy cloths that obviously hadn't been changed for weeks. She took what she needed and returned to where the coffee was spread, carefully kneeling on the cold floor. Harrison positioned himself directly above her, close enough that she could see the dirt under his fingernails and the wear on his leather slippers. Eleanor began cleaning the coffee with methodical movements, deliberately ignoring the fact that Harrison was clearly expecting her to use her own clothing. "Clean it, on your knees. And if you don't have enough cloth, use your own blouse," he ordered in a harsh voice. Eleanor paused for a moment, then began using the hem of her dress to absorb the coffee. The humiliation burned like acid in her veins, but Eleanor transformed it into fuel for her determination. She scrubbed the floor with the hem of her dress, the grey fabric becoming stained with dark brown, while Harrison watched with sick satisfaction. Eleanor could feel his eyes on her like insects crawling on her skin, but she kept her movements controlled and submissive. The smell of rancid coffee mixed with cheap cleaning product created a nauseating combination that made her eyes water. Harrison stepped forward and, with calculated cruelty, stepped into the puddle of coffee that Eleanor had not yet reached, spreading the liquid even more with the dirty sole of his slipper. The movement was so deliberate, so unnecessarily cruel, that Eleanor had to bite the inside of her cheek to avoid reacting. She simply moved to clean the new stain, her knees already beginning to hurt against the hard marble. The hallway seemed to have become a stage for Harrison's sadistic performance, and Eleanor was both actress and audience. "You know what you are? A nothing. Born to serve people like me," Harrison said with venom in his voice. Eleanor continued cleaning, transforming each word into another nail in the coffin she was building for him. Harrison's words continued to rain down on Eleanor like blows, each designed to destroy any trace of dignity she might have. Eleanor kept her head down, her hair partially hiding her face as she continued to scrub the floor, but her mind was sharp as a razor, recording every insult for the day of reckoning. Harrison began walking in circles around her, occasionally kicking more dirt onto the clean floor, forcing her to redo the work. The marble was finally beginning to show its original shine under her efforts, revealing veins of grey and gold that ran through the white stone like frozen rivers. Eleanor noticed her hands were becoming red from the effort and cleaning product, but she didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't give Harrison the satisfaction of seeing her falter. The sun had moved in the sky, and now cast long shadows across the hallway, creating a pattern of light and darkness that seemed appropriate for the moment. Harrison stopped circling and leaned against the wall, watching her with the casual interest of someone watching an insect struggle. "Some are born to command, others to kneel. It's the natural order of things," he philosophized with pompous arrogance. Eleanor finally finished cleaning, sat back on her heels and looked at him with empty eyes, letting him interpret her silence as total submission. Harrison seemed satisfied with Eleanor's show of subservience and gestured for her to follow him to other parts of the house. Eleanor stood up with some difficulty, her knees protesting after so much time on the hard floor, but she showed no discomfort. They walked through the mansion, and Harrison showed each room with derogatory comments about the work of previous housekeepers and how he expected absolute perfection. The kitchen was in a deplorable state, with dirty dishes piled in the sink, hardened food remains in pots, and a sour smell that suggested the trash hadn't been taken out for days. Eleanor noticed dead cockroaches in the corners and grease stains that climbed up the walls to the ceiling. Harrison opened the refrigerator, revealing spoiled food and moldy containers, and then closed it with indifference. The main bathroom was even worse, with moisture stains on the ceiling, broken tiles, and a toilet that clearly hadn't been properly cleaned for weeks. Eleanor maintained her neutral expression, while mentally making a list of everything she would need to do, not to please Harrison, but to have complete access to the house. The previous housekeeper was useless. "I hope you're better," Harrison commented with disdain. Eleanor nodded, already planning how to use each moment alone for her investigation. Harrison took her back to the main hallway and began giving orders about her tasks for the day, each more degrading than the last. Eleanor was to clean all the bathrooms in the house, wash and iron accumulated clothes, prepare lunch and dinner, and completely clean the kitchen. It was enough work for 3 people, but Eleanor just nodded at each demand, knowing Harrison was testing her limits. He disappeared into his office, leaving her alone for the first time since she arrived. Eleanor immediately began mentally mapping the house, noting where non-functioning security cameras were located, broken locks, places where she could hide things if necessary. She started with the farthest bathroom, working methodically, but always alert to the sounds of the house. She could hear Harrison on the phone in his office, his voice loud and aggressive as he argued with someone about money. Eleanor smiled for the first time that day, a small and dangerous smile that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. She found a locked door at the end of the second-floor hallway and mentally filed it for future investigation. "I need to know all the secrets of this house," she thought as she scrubbed. Each cleaned room was one step closer to her revenge. Lunch was a particular test of endurance for Eleanor, not because of the difficulty in preparing the food, but having to serve Harrison while he ate like a pig. He chewed with his mouth open, dropping food on his already stained shirt, and made cruel comments about the food even as he devoured everything. Eleanor remained standing beside the table as he had ordered, watching him eat and ready to attend to any demand. Harrison deliberately knocked over the salt shaker, then the sauce, creating a mess that Eleanor had to clean up immediately. He seemed to find special pleasure in making her kneel repeatedly to clean up his intentional messes. The dining room had large windows overlooking the destroyed garden, and Eleanor could see the exact spot where Josiah had worked with such pride. The rose bushes were dead or dying, choked by parasites and neglect. Harrison followed her gaze and smiled cruelly. "Years ago I had a gardener. Thought he could steal from me," he began, and Eleanor had to dig her nails into her palms. She knew what was coming next, but she had to listen, had to maintain her mask. Harrison continued his story with evident sadistic pleasure, embellishing details and brazenly lying about the events of that fateful day. Eleanor kept her expression neutral as he described Josiah as a thief, a dishonest man who had tried to take advantage of his kindness. Each word was a stab in Eleanor's heart, but also more fuel for the fire of her revenge. Harrison described in unnecessary detail how Josiah had begged when the police arrived, painting her father as a coward when Eleanor knew he had been the bravest man she had ever known. The afternoon sun streamed through the dirty windows, creating a grotesque halo around Harrison's head as he continued his venomous narrative. Eleanor served him more wine, noticing how his hands trembled slightly, not from age but from the alcohol he constantly consumed. Harrison mentioned the gardener's daughter with particular disdain, describing child Eleanor as a pathetic, whiny creature. Eleanor had to turn away to hide her expression for a moment, pretending to arrange something on the table. "Died like the worm he was, right here where you're kneeling." "Had a daughter, a whiny brat," said Harrison with cruel satisfaction. Eleanor forced herself to continue cleaning, each movement a small victory over her desire to reveal everything right there. The afternoon dragged on with more humiliations and impossible tasks, Harrison appearing periodically to check Eleanor's work and always finding something to criticize. He made her clean the same bathroom 3 times, claiming it was still dirty, when they both knew it was impeccable. Eleanor went up and down the stairs countless times, carrying heavy buckets of water, furniture that Harrison decided needed to be moved, and dusty boxes from the attic that he wanted to check. Her muscles screamed in protest, but Eleanor had been through worse during her self-imposed training over the last few years. She had prepared herself physically and mentally for this day, strengthening her body with exercise and her mind with meditation and focus. Harrison seemed frustrated by her resistance, expecting to see her break, beg for a break or show weakness. But Eleanor continued methodical and silent, like a machine programmed to clean. The sky began to darken outside, and the shadows in the house lengthened, making the environment even more oppressive. "Probably became a beggar or worse," Harrison repeated his story about the gardener's daughter to a visitor who briefly arrived. Eleanor, cleaning in the hallway, squeezed the cloth so hard that her knuckles turned white as bones. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor began working at the Mendonça mansion, and each day had been a silent battle of resistance and observation. She now knew every corner of the house, every creak of the floorboards, every door that didn't close properly, every hiding place where Harrison kept bottles of expensive liquor. Eleanor had established a routine that allowed her to explore the mansion while pretending to perform her endless tasks, always alert to Harrison's heavy footsteps echoing through the corridors. The millionaire maintained his daily cruelty, but Eleanor had learned to transform each humiliation into another piece of information about his habits and weaknesses. That particular night, Harrison had gone out for a business dinner, leaving her alone in the mansion for the first time in a week. Eleanor climbed the stairs leading to the attic, a place Harrison had vaguely mentioned but never asked her to clean, her hands holding a flashlight since the attic light had burned out years ago. The air was heavy with decades of accumulated dust, and each step raised clouds that danced in the beam of light. "If there's anything hidden in this house, it's up here," thought Eleanor as she pushed the heavy door. The creak of rusty hinges echoed like a lament for the secrets about to be revealed. The attic was a mausoleum of forgotten memories, with furniture covered by white sheets that looked like ghosts in the dim light, and boxes stacked to the ceiling creating a labyrinth of cardboard and wood. Eleanor moved the flashlight slowly across the space, revealing cobwebs that hung like torn curtains, and the occasional gleam of rat eyes disappearing into the shadows. The smell was a mixture of mold, old paper, and something sweet that Eleanor couldn't identify, perhaps old perfume or flowers long forgotten. She began methodically from one corner, opening boxes containing old clothes, dusty photo albums, and objects that clearly hadn't been touched in years. Eleanor found elegant dresses that must have belonged to Isabel, Harrison's deceased wife, still in plastic covers but yellowed by time. There were jewels in velvet boxes, necklaces probably worth fortunes, abandoned there as if they had no value at all. Eleanor continued her search, moving heavy boxes carefully to avoid making noise, even knowing Harrison wouldn't return for hours. "There's something here he doesn't want found," she muttered to herself. Her intuition, sharpened by years of observation and survival, had never failed before. It was in the 3rd row of boxes, hidden behind an old wardrobe, that Eleanor found what she didn't know she was looking for. The box was different from the others, newer, sealed with thick adhesive tape and multiple layers, as if someone had wanted to ensure it would never be opened accidentally. Eleanor carefully cut the tape using a key she always carried, and inside found clearly feminine belongings. A brown leather diary, letters tied with a faded red ribbon, photographs of Isabel smiling in happier times. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in bubble wrap and hidden inside a hollow gardening book, was something completely unexpected. An old external hard drive, the kind that was used 15 years ago. Eleanor held it against the flashlight, noticing there was a small label with a handwritten date exactly 15 years ago. Her heart began to beat faster when she realized the date was just a few days before Isabel's death, Harrison's wife. Eleanor carefully placed the hard drive in her pocket and continued examining the contents of the box, finding newspaper clippings about Isabel's death, all talking about a tragic domestic accident. Eleanor reorganized everything exactly as she had found it, sealing the box again with adhesive tape she had brought in advance to cover her tracks. She descended from the attic moving like a shadow, each step calculated to avoid the creaking boards, knowledge acquired in 3 weeks of careful observation. In her maid's room downstairs, a tiny cubicle that Harrison had designated for her with cruel pleasure, Eleanor had hidden an old laptop she had bought with her savings. It was an old and slow machine, but it worked, and more importantly, it was completely off anyone's radar. Eleanor connected the hard drive with hands that trembled slightly with anticipation, not fear. The screen flickered as the computer recognized the device, and a window opened showing dozens of video files, all meticulously dated. Eleanor clicked on the first file, dated the day of Isabel's death, and what she saw made her blood freeze. It was a security camera recording of the second-floor hallway of the mansion, showing the stairs where Isabel had supposedly fallen. "My God," whispered Eleanor as the grainy image came into focus. The quality was poor, typical of old cameras, but it was possible to see everything clearly enough. In the video, the scene unfolded in slow motion in Eleanor's mind, even though the video continued at normal speed. An argument between Harrison and his wife. The camera captured the exact moment when Harrison's expression changed from anger to something colder, more calculated. "You will not destroy my reputation," shouted Harrison in the video with a fury that Eleanor recognized. It was the same voice, the same tone he had used when accusing Josiah of theft, the same cruel certainty of someone who believed himself above all consequences. That's when the most shocking revelation of all occurred, something Eleanor could never have anticipated in her most elaborate plans for revenge. In the video, a familiar figure appeared climbing the stairs, carrying a box of gardening tools. Eleanor gasped and covered her mouth with her hand to muffle the sound, even though she was alone. It was Josiah, her father, younger and stronger, climbing the stairs probably to make some repair on the second floor as part of his many responsibilities. Josiah stopped abruptly in the middle of the staircase when he saw the scene unfolding above him, his face transforming from professional concentration to absolute shock. The video clearly showed the moment when Josiah witnessed the unthinkable. In the recording, an intense argument could be seen. Harrison grabbed Isabel, and then she fell down the stairs. Josiah witnessed everything and ran to try to help her. "Father," Eleanor whispered with tears streaming down her face. He had tried to save her, even knowing the danger he faced. The video continued showing Josiah kneeling, trying to help his employer. Harrison didn't say a word, just stared fixedly at Josiah, and made a slow and deliberate gesture running his finger across his own throat. Josiah backed away, stumbling over his own tools, clearly frightened. Eleanor paused the video again, her hands trembling so much that she had difficulty clicking the mouse. She took several deep breaths, trying to process what she was seeing. Her father had witnessed something terrible against Isabel, and Harrison had used this to destroy him. He had seen too much, Eleanor murmured, finally understanding. The theft accusation hadn't been random. It had been a calculated and planned execution. Eleanor copied all the videos to multiple devices, hiding copies in different places to ensure the evidence would never be lost. She spent the entire night watching and re-watching the videos, memorizing every detail, every word, every gesture. When the sun began to rise, painting the sky orange through the small window of her room, Eleanor had already formulated her plan. She would wait until the perfect moment, when Harrison was most vulnerable, and then reveal everything. The laptop was charged and ready in the dining room, hidden under a tablecloth. The documents transferring all of Harrison's fortune and assets were in her purse, along with an expensive pen she had taken from the mansion owner's desk. Eleanor prepared breakfast with special care, making all of Harrison's favorite dishes to ensure he would be in a good mood and complacent. She wore her usual uniform, but carried within her a different energy, the calm before the storm. Harrison came down the stairs at his usual time, complaining about a backache and demanding his extra strong coffee. Eleanor served everything in silence, watching him eat while mentally reviewing each step of what was about to happen. The clock on the wall showed 9 in the morning, the same time Josiah had been arrested 24 years ago. Eleanor considered this poetically appropriate. When Harrison finished eating and was preparing to go to his office to read his newspaper, he began another of his cruel humiliation routines. He deliberately spilled the rest of his coffee on the clean floor and pointed to the stain with a sadistic smile. "Look at this mess, you useless thing. Clean it up now, on your knees as always," he ordered with sick pleasure. Eleanor knelt as she had done so many times, but when Harrison approached to continue with his insults, stepping near the puddle to spread the liquid further, something changed. He began his usual degradation speech, saying how pathetic she was, how worthless, how she was less than an animal. Eleanor stopped cleaning, slowly dropped the cloth on the floor and stood up, her painful knees protesting. Harrison was in the middle of a particularly cruel phrase when Eleanor looked him directly in the eyes for the first time. "I am Eleanor," she said in a clear and firm voice, each word cutting through the air like a blade. Harrison stumbled backward as if physically struck, his coffee cup falling and shattering on the floor. "Follow me immediately." Harrison's expression quickly changed from shock to anger, his eyebrows coming together as he processed the fact that his mute maid had just spoken. Eleanor remained perfectly calm, observing the confusion and fury fighting for control on his face. She calmly walked to where she had hidden the laptop, taking it from its hiding place and placing it on the dining table. Harrison stood up abruptly, his chair falling backwards with the sudden movement, and Eleanor could see his hands closing into fists. For a moment, she thought he might try to physically attack her, but then curiosity overcame anger. Harrison approached cautiously, as if the laptop were a bomb about to explode. Eleanor opened the device and clicked on the video file she had prepared, the one that clearly showed the moment of Isabel's murder. The screen came to life with grainy but unmistakable images, and Eleanor watched with grim satisfaction as all the blood drained from Harrison's face. "What? How did you?" he stammered, unable to form a complete sentence. Eleanor let the video play, each second a nail in the coffin of Harrison's arrogance. Harrison fell heavily into the nearest chair, his eyes fixed on the screen as he watched his life crumble in real time. Eleanor could see the exact moment when he recognized Josiah in the video, the moment when he understood all the implications of what was happening. When Isabel fell in the footage, Harrison covered his face with his hands, but Eleanor felt no pity. She had waited 24 years for this moment, and she wouldn't allow him to hide from the truth. When the video ended, the silence in the room was deafening. Harrison slowly lowered his hands and looked at Eleanor, and for the first time since she had entered that house, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. Eleanor closed the laptop and crossed her arms, waiting for him to speak. Harrison opened and closed his mouth several times, looking like a fish out of water, before finally finding his voice. But when he spoke, it wasn't to deny or defend himself. "I'm Eleanor, Josiah's daughter. My father saw you kill your wife," Eleanor said before he could speak. Harrison paled even more if that was possible, and Eleanor saw the exact moment when he made all the connections. The silence stretched between them like an abyss, filled only by the ticking of the clock and Harrison's heavy breathing. Eleanor observed as he processed the magnitude of his situation, seeing the gears turning in his mind as he tried to find a way out. But there was no way out, and they both knew it. Harrison finally found his voice, but it was only a hoarse whisper that hardly seemed to come from the same man who had shouted cruel orders for weeks. His hands visibly trembled as he tried to reach for the water glass on the table, knocking it over in the process. The water spread across the polished wooden surface, but neither of them moved to clean it up. Eleanor remained standing, a statue of determination and delayed justice, watching the man who had destroyed her life come undone before her. Harrison tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him, and he fell back into the chair. The transformation was impressive. The arrogant and cruel millionaire had become an old and broken man in a matter of minutes. "Eleanor, your father. He saw everything," Harrison finally managed to say, the words coming out brokenly. Eleanor nodded once, her face an ice mask that hid the turmoil of emotions inside her. Eleanor walked slowly around the table, each step measured and deliberate, until she was directly in front of Harrison. She could see the sweat forming on his forehead, could practically smell the fear emanating from him in waves. It was the same fear that Josiah must have felt when he was accused, the same terror that Eleanor felt when she saw her father die. But unlike them, Harrison deserved every second of agony he was experiencing. Eleanor took the transfer documents from her purse and placed them on the table in front of him, along with the expensive pen she had stolen from his office. Harrison looked at the papers as if they were a death sentence, which in a way they were. Eleanor could see that he was considering his options, trying to calculate if he could somehow escape this trap. But she had been meticulous in her preparation. The documents were perfect. The video was incontestable proof, and Harrison had nowhere to run. Eleanor leaned slightly forward, her voice low but charged with years of pent-up anger when she spoke. "And you accused him of theft to silence him, so no one would believe him if he spoke. Sign these documents, now everything you have will be mine, all your money," she said with a calmness that contradicted the fire in her eyes. Harrison began to cry, pathetic tears streaming down his wrinkled face. Harrison's tears did not move Eleanor a millimeter. She had cried oceans for her father, had shed enough tears to fill the fountain in the garden where she used to play. His tears were empty, born from fear of consequences, not genuine remorse. Eleanor pushed the documents closer to him, the pen rolling until it touched his trembling hand. Harrison looked at the papers through his tears, trying to read what he was signing. But Eleanor knew it didn't matter. He would sign anything to avoid prison, to maintain his freedom, even if he lost his fortune and possessions. The silence extended as Harrison struggled with his decision, but Eleanor knew there was really no choice. She held all the cards, all the power that he had flaunted over her and her father now completely reversed. Harrison picked up the pen with fingers that shook like leaves in the wind, and Eleanor watched with satisfaction as he began to sign his name on the documents. I was desperate. He had seen too much. Harrison mumbled between sobs, trying to justify the unjustifiable. Eleanor didn't respond, just watched as he signed each page, transferring all his fortune, his mansion, his bank accounts, everything to the name of Clara Silver. When the last signature was made, Eleanor took the documents and carefully put them in her purse. Harrison remained seated, emptied, as if signing those papers had drained all his life force. Eleanor went to the hallway closet, where she had hidden the gardener's clothes, and threw them in his lap. Harrison looked at the simple clothes with incomprehension, his brain still trying to process the speed at which his life had changed. Eleanor crossed her arms and waited, watching as understanding slowly came to his eyes. The clothes were almost identical to those Josiah wore, the same coarse fabric, the same sun-faded color. Harrison began to shake his head frantically, mumbling incoherent denials, but Eleanor remained inflexible. She had planned every detail of this moment, every element of humiliation he would suffer. Harrison tried to stand up again, the clothes falling to the floor, but Eleanor stepped forward, and he instinctively backed away. "Now you're going to work as a gardener, like my father worked. Put these clothes on," Eleanor ordered with cold authority. Harrison looked at her with pleading eyes, but found only relentless determination. Harrison moved like a man in a trance, picking up the clothes from the floor and walking slowly toward the bathroom to change. Eleanor followed him, ensuring he wouldn't try to escape or do something desperate. When he emerged wearing the gardener's clothes, the transformation was complete. The arrogant millionaire had disappeared, replaced by an old and broken man in work clothes that seemed to weigh tons upon his shoulders. Eleanor led him to the garden, the same garden that Josiah had cared for with such love, and that was now destroyed by neglect. She pointed to the rusty tools that were abandoned in the shed, and watched as Harrison picked them up with hands that were still shaking. The sun was high in the sky, hot and merciless, exactly as it had been on the day Josiah was arrested. Eleanor sat on the porch, in the same place where Harrison had watched Josiah's destruction, and observed as he awkwardly tried to prune the dead rose bushes. Every movement of his was monitored, every mistake noted. For an entire week, Eleanor made him work under the scorching sun, making him experience a fraction of what Josiah had suffered. "You're doing it wrong," she said coldly as he struggled with the pruning shears. Harrison merely nodded, sweat running down his face, without energy even to protest. The week passed in a routine of exhausting work for Harrison and vigilant observation for Eleanor. She made him wake at dawn, work until sunset with only small breaks for water. Harrison, who had never done manual labor in his life, struggled with every task. Eleanor felt no pity. She remembered Josiah's calloused hands, marked by years of honest work, and compared them with Harrison's hands, now finally knowing what real work was. She made him carry heavy bags of fertilizer, dig holes for new plants, clean the ornamental lake that was covered with slime. When Harrison tried to rest, Eleanor threw water on the stone floor and made him clean it, exactly as he had done with her. Each day Harrison grew weaker, more broken, closer to collapse. On the 6th day, Harrison begged for mercy, kneeling before her in the same place where Josiah had died. "Please, Eleanor, I've done everything you ordered," he cried, his tears falling on the dry earth. Eleanor just pointed to more work to be done, her heart hardened by years of suffering. On the 7th day, Eleanor woke Harrison before dawn and made him wear the gardener's clothes one last time. He could barely move, his elderly body not accustomed to the intense physical work of recent days. Eleanor led him to the garden and made him kneel exactly where Josiah had fallen, where her father had taken his last breath. Harrison was so exhausted that he could barely remain upright, swaying slightly as the rising sun began to illuminate the garden. Eleanor took out her phone and dialed the police number, watching the horror grow in Harrison's eyes as he realized what was happening. She had planted the gardening tools in his former room the night before, creating false evidence of theft, exactly as he had done with Josiah. But unlike Harrison, Eleanor had something real to report. When the call was answered, Eleanor spoke in a clear and calm voice, reporting a murder that occurred 15 years ago and a current theft. Harrison tried to stand up, tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. "I want to report a murder and a theft," Eleanor said on the phone, her eyes never leaving Harrison. He began to beg, crawling toward her, but Eleanor took a step back, keeping her distance. Police sirens began to sound in the distance, the same sound that had preceded the destruction of Eleanor's life 24 years ago. Harrison was in total panic now, alternating between begging for mercy and trying to explain himself. Eleanor handed the arriving police officers a copy of the video of Isabel's murder, along with the planted evidence of the alleged theft. The officers watched the video right there, their faces becoming increasingly serious as they observed Harrison doing something terrible to his wife. When they turned to Harrison with handcuffs in hand, he began to scream desperately. Eleanor approached him as the officers handcuffed him, getting close enough to whisper in his ear. The garden was silent, except for Harrison's pathetic sobs and the metallic clinking of the handcuffs being closed. Eleanor could feel Josiah's ghost there with her, finally receiving justice after all these years. "Eleanor, please, I did everything you asked. I can't be arrested," Harrison shouted as he was dragged away. Eleanor took one final step closer and whispered with venom distilled from 24 years of pain, "My father was innocent and couldn't either. He didn't survive. Let's see what happens to you." Harrison's screams echoed through the garden as he was dragged to the police car, proclaiming his innocence about the theft with the same vehemence that Josiah had done all those years ago. Eleanor watched with an expressionless face, feeling neither joy nor sadness, just an emptiness where anger had burned for so long. The officers were professional, but clearly disturbed by the video they had seen, and one of them approached Eleanor to ask more questions. She calmly explained how she had discovered the video, how she had recognized her father in the images, how she had planned everything to obtain justice. The officer nodded, taking notes, clearly impressed with her patience and determination. As the police car drove away with Harrison inside, still screaming and struggling, Eleanor turned to look at the mansion that was now hers. There was no satisfaction in victory, just a deep weariness that penetrated to her bones. She had completed her mission, had avenged her father, but the emptiness inside her remained. "I am innocent of the theft. Eleanor." Harrison's screams could be heard even as the car turned the corner. Eleanor responded to the silence of the garden. "My father was too. Let's see if you survive." 10 years had passed since that fateful day in the garden, and Harrison emerged from the gates of the penitentiary as a shadow of the man he had been. At 65, each day in prison had carved deep furrows in his face, transforming his once arrogant features into a mask of weariness and regret. His clothes, the same ones he had worn on the day of his conviction, now hung loose on his body, shrunken by time and poor institutional food. The morning sun blinded him momentarily, and Harrison had to lean on the concrete wall to avoid falling, his weak knees protesting after years in a small cell. There was no one waiting for him, no car, no friend, just the emptiness of a freedom that meant nothing when you have nowhere to go. The guard who had accompanied him to the gate had already gone back inside, leaving Harrison completely alone for the first time in a decade. He began to walk without direction, his feet automatically taking him toward the only place that still had any meaning in his destroyed life. "I need to see her one last time," Harrison muttered to himself. The cold morning wind cut through his thin clothes, making him shiver as he walked. The journey to the mansion was long and painful, with Harrison having to stop several times to catch his breath, his elderly and sick body fighting against every step. The streets had changed dramatically in 10 years. New buildings where houses once stood, modern shops replacing the family businesses he vaguely remembered. People passed by him without a second glance, just another old indigent wandering the streets, invisible in his insignificance. Harrison had no money for transportation. He had left prison with only the belongings he had when he entered, which weren't many. His feet began to hurt inside his old and tight shoes, and he could feel blisters forming, but he kept walking. The mansion was his north, his only goal, even without knowing exactly why he needed to get there. Perhaps it was to ask forgiveness, perhaps to find some kind of closure, or perhaps simply because he had nowhere else in the world. When he finally spotted the familiar gates, Harrison stopped, his heart beating irregularly in his chest. 10 years, he whispered, looking at the property. The mansion had been completely transformed, the gardens now lush and perfectly maintained, the house painted and renovated. Harrison approached the gate with hesitant steps, noting the modern security system that had been installed, the cameras that followed his movements, the elegant intercom beside the entrance. He pressed the button with a trembling finger, waiting as the device buzzed softly. A young female voice answered, polite but distant, asking who he was and what he wanted. Harrison tried to speak, but his voice came out hoarse and broken, years of silence in prison having taken their toll. He cleared his throat and tried again, explaining that he was an old acquaintance of Mrs. Eleanor and needed to see her urgently. There was a long pause, and Harrison could hear muffled voices in the background, discussion, hesitation. Finally, the gate opened with an electronic click, and Harrison entered the property that had once been his. Each step on the perfectly aligned stone path was a memory. Each flower in the restored garden was a silent accusation. A young maid waited for him at the door, her immaculate uniform contrasting with Harrison's worn appearance. "Please wait here," she said, clearly uncomfortable with his presence. Harrison nodded, remaining in the entrance hall as the young woman disappeared up the stairs. The maid returned after what seemed like hours, her face now marked by genuine concern. She looked at Harrison with a mixture of pity and confusion, clearly not understanding who this shabby old man was who insisted on seeing her mistress. Harrison could hear her shallow breathing as she struggled to find the right words, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her apron. The hall was silent except for the ticking of a new wall clock, marking seconds that seemed to drag like hours. Light filtered through the lace curtains, created delicate patterns on the marble floor, now shiny and unstained, so different from how Harrison had left it. The young woman finally found her voice, but the words came out hesitant and careful, as if she feared his reaction. Harrison leaned against the wall to keep himself standing when he heard what she had to say, his already fragile world threatening to completely collapse. "Mrs. Eleanor is very ill. She's not receiving anyone," the maid informed him in a soft but firm voice. Harrison felt his legs weaken, but forced himself to remain standing, his need to see Eleanor overcoming his physical weakness. Harrison began to beg with an urgency that surprised even himself, words pouring from his mouth in a desperate torrent. He explained that he had known Eleanor many years ago, that there was something important he needed to tell her, that he wouldn't leave until he could see her, even if just for a moment. The maid backed away slightly, clearly disturbed by the intensity of his plea, but something in his eyes made her hesitate before simply sending him away. Harrison fell to his knees right there in the hall, his hands joined in supplication, tears beginning to stream down his time-marked face. It was the same position Eleanor had put him in the garden 10 years ago, but now it was voluntary, born of genuine despair. The young maid looked around nervously, clearly out of her depth, before finally giving in. She helped Harrison to his feet, her young and strong arms supporting his fragile weight, and began to guide him upstairs. Each step was a mountain for Harrison, his lungs burning with the effort, dark spots dancing in the periphery of his vision. "Please don't upset her too much," the maid softly requested. Harrison merely nodded, unable to speak as he struggled to breathe. The second-floor hallway was dark, heavy curtains blocking most of the daylight, creating a funeral atmosphere that made Harrison's heart sink even further. The maid led him to a door at the end of the corridor, the same one that had been the master bedroom when it was his house. She knocked gently and opened the door just enough for Harrison to enter, remaining outside like a sentinel. What Harrison saw when he entered the room completely devastated him, robbing any remaining strength from his legs and causing him to lean heavily on the doorframe. Helena was lying in bed, but was almost unrecognizable as the strong, determined woman who had orchestrated his downfall. She was terribly pale, her skin with an unhealthy yellowish tinge, her sunken eyes surrounded by dark circles that looked like bruises. Medical machines surrounded the bed, emitting soft and constant beeps, tubes and wires connected to her fragile body. Harrison took a hesitant step forward, and Eleanor slowly turned her head in his direction, the movement clearly causing her pain. When their eyes met, Harrison saw a flash of the old fire before it extinguished into tired resignation. "Come to watch me die?" Eleanor whispered in a voice so weak that Harrison could barely hear. He opened his mouth to respond, to deny, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Before Harrison could formulate any response, Eleanor's eyes rolled back and her body went completely limp against the pillows. The monitors beside the bed began to beep frantically, red lights flashing in urgent alarm. Harrison threw himself forward, catching Eleanor's cold, inert hand in his, shouting for help, with a voice that echoed through the corridors. The maid burst into the room, quickly followed by a private nurse whom Harrison hadn't noticed was in the house. The two women worked quickly around Eleanor, checking vital signs, adjusting medications, speaking in medical terms that Harrison didn't understand. He was pushed to the corner, but refused to let go of Eleanor's hand, remaining connected to her like an anchor. The nurse grabbed her phone and dialed quickly, requesting an ambulance with maximum urgency. Harrison could hear the sirens approaching, the sound bringing terrible memories of another day, another collapse, another life in danger. But this time was different. This time he wasn't the cause of the tragedy. "Please, Eleanor, don't go. Forgive me. The world deserves people like you, not like me," Harrison pleaded. The paramedics arrived in minutes that seemed like hours, invading the room with equipment and professional efficiency. Harrison was forced to step aside as they transferred Eleanor to a stretcher, connecting her to more machines, inserting an intravenous line, placing an oxygen mask over her face. He followed them as they rushed through the house, descending the stairs with quick care, Eleanor unconscious and vulnerable between them. Harrison had to practically run to keep up, his lungs protesting, his legs threatening to give out with each step. When they reached the ambulance, one of the paramedics tried to prevent him from entering, but Harrison begged with such desperation that the man yielded. Throughout the journey to the hospital, Harrison held Eleanor's hand, talking to her even without knowing if she could hear him. He told her about prison, about the years of regret, about how he had relived that day in the garden thousands of times, wishing he could change it. The paramedics worked around him, monitoring Eleanor's vital signs, communicating with the hospital via radio. "Female patient, 30s, acute renal failure," Harrison heard one of them say. His heart sank even further upon understanding the gravity of the situation. At the hospital, Eleanor was immediately taken to the intensive care unit, leaving Harrison alone in the sterile waiting room. He sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his hands still trembling, the feeling of Eleanor's cold hand persisting in his palm. Other patients and family members came and went, but Harrison remained motionless, lost in thoughts and memories. After what seemed like an eternity, a middle-aged doctor with thick-rimmed glasses approached him. The man had a grave expression that told everything even before speaking. Harrison stood up with difficulty, preparing himself for the worst. The doctor led him to a private room, closing the door behind them for privacy. The room was small and impersonal, with institutional chairs and a table with brochures about various medical conditions. The doctor sat down and gestured for Harrison to do the same, his movements weary from someone accustomed to delivering bad news. Harrison sat on the edge of the chair, his body tense like a violin string about to snap. "Are you a relative of the patient?" asked the doctor with gentle professionalism. Harrison hesitated before answering, not knowing how to define his relationship with Eleanor. Harrison finally replied that he was an old acquaintance, someone who owed Eleanor a great deal, more than he could express in words. The doctor nodded, accepting the vague explanation without questioning, probably accustomed to complicated relationships between patients and visitors. He opened Eleanor's medical chart and began to explain the situation with clinical clarity that did not diminish the gravity of the words. Eleanor was suffering from end-stage renal failure. Her kidneys had completely stopped functioning, and without an immediate transplant, she had at most days to live. Harrison felt the air leave his lungs as if he had been punched, the cruel irony of the situation not lost on him. The doctor continued explaining that Eleanor had an extremely rare blood type, making finding a compatible donor almost impossible in the available time. She had been on the waiting list for months, but her condition had deteriorated rapidly in recent weeks. Harrison listened to each word like nails being hammered into a coffin, each medical detail a death sentence. End-stage renal failure. She needs a transplant immediately or she will die in days. Her blood type is extremely rare, the doctor concluded grimly. Harrison straightened in his chair, a desperate idea forming in his mind. Before the doctor could continue with his explanations about palliative care and necessary preparations, Harrison interrupted him with an urgency that surprised them both. His voice came out stronger than it had been in years, charged with a determination he had thought lost forever. The doctor stopped mid-sentence, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose as he stared at Harrison with surprise. The room fell silent for a moment, only the distant hum of the hospital's ventilation system filling the void. Harrison leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk with enough force to make his joints ache. He could feel his heart beating irregularly, but not from fear, rather from a desperate hope that refused to die. The doctor adjusted his glasses and opened his mouth to speak, probably to explain the procedures and requirements for organ donation. "Test me!" Harrison practically shouted, cutting the doctor off before he could begin. The man blinked, clearly not expecting this reaction from someone who appeared so fragile and ill. The doctor leaned back in his chair, studying Harrison with new interest, mixed with evident professional concern. He carefully explained that kidney donation was a serious procedure, especially for someone of Harrison's age and with his clearly compromised medical history. The doctor could see the obvious signs of years of deprivation, the subtle yellowing of the skin suggesting liver problems, the tremor in his hands that could indicate a range of conditions. Harrison listened impatiently, drumming his fingers on the desk. Each second lost in explanations was 1 second less in Eleanor's life. The doctor picked up a clipboard and began asking questions about Harrison's medical history, each question revealing more potential problems. Harrison had developed diabetes in prison, high blood pressure, had suffered a severe pneumonia 2 years ago that had nearly killed him. The doctor shook his head more and more as he took notes, clearly coming to the conclusion that Harrison was not a viable candidate. Frustration grew in Harrison like bile in his throat, threatening to explode into anger. "Sir, at 65 years old and with your prison health history, donating a kidney could kill you," the doctor finally said with gentle but firm finality. Harrison slammed his fist on the desk, making the papers jump. Harrison's determination did not waver for even a second in the face of the doctor's warnings. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping noisily against the linoleum floor, and began to speak with a passion he had thought dead inside him. He explained about Josiah, about the false accusation, about how he had destroyed 2 lives with his greed and cruelty. He told about the 10 years in prison reliving that day, about the weight of guilt that crushed him more with each passing year. The doctor listened in silence, his professionalism struggling against human compassion as the story unfolded. Harrison spoke about how Eleanor had been just a child when he destroyed her life, how she had waited 24 years for justice. Tears were now streaming freely down Harrison's face, But he didn't care. All his dignity had been stripped away years ago. He begged the doctor to at least run the tests, to give him the chance to do one right thing in his miserable life. The doctor sighed deeply, removing his glasses to rub his tired eyes. "Test me," Harrison practically begged, falling to his knees right there in the office. The doctor helped him up, his face showing that he had made a decision. Against his better medical judgment, the doctor agreed to conduct the compatibility tests. He warned Harrison once more about the risks, making him sign multiple consent forms that basically stated the hospital would not be responsible if he died in the process. Harrison signed each one without even reading, his signature shaky but determined on every line. He was taken to an examination room where nurses drew what seemed like liters of blood, took x-rays, electrocardiograms, a battery of tests that left Harrison dizzy and exhausted. He sat in a wheelchair while waiting for the results, too weak to stand but too determined to lie down. The hours dragged like molasses, each minute an eternity, while somewhere in the hospital, Eleanor fought for her life. Harrison could occasionally hear codes being called over the sound system, each one making his heart stop, as he feared it was for Eleanor. A young nurse brought him water and crackers, clearly pitying the old man determined to sacrifice himself. "Why are you doing this?" she asked gently while checking his blood pressure. Harrison looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and simply replied, "Because it's the only right thing I can do." The doctor returned after what felt like days but was probably just a few hours, his face showing an expression of disbelief that Harrison couldn't interpret. He held the test results in his hands, looking between the papers and Harrison as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The waiting room had emptied considerably. Only a few other patients remained, all lost in their own medical dramas. The doctor sat beside Harrison instead of across from him, a more personal gesture that suggested significant news. Harrison could hear his own heart beating in his ears, the sound almost deafening in the tense silence. The doctor cleared his throat, clearly searching for the right words to convey what he had discovered. The papers in his hands trembled slightly, whether from emotion or fatigue, Harrison couldn't tell. Finally, the doctor looked directly into Harrison's eyes, and there was something like admiration mixed with concern in his gaze. "Mr. Harrison," he began slowly, "the results show something extraordinary." Harrison leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe as he waited for the revelation. The doctor explained that miraculously, Harrison was a perfect match for Eleanor, something that happened in less than 1% of cases between non-relatives. Not only did the rare blood type match, but all other compatibility markers were aligned in a way the doctor described as statistically impossible. Harrison felt fresh tears spring to his eyes, but this time they were of relief, of gratitude, of something resembling hope. The doctor quickly tempered the good news with the reality of the situation. Harrison's health condition made the surgery extremely risky. There was a significant chance he would not survive the procedure, and even if he did, his life would be drastically shortened. Harrison impatiently waved his hand, dismissing the concerns as irrelevant. He had lived 65 years, most of them wasted in greed and cruelty, the last 10 in deserved punishment. If he could give Eleanor more years than he had stolen from her and her father, it would be worth any price. The doctor sighed, recognizing the unwavering determination in Harrison's eyes. "I need to speak with the patient first," the doctor said. Harrison nodded, understanding that Eleanor had to agree to this. Harrison was taken to Eleanor's ICU room, now stabilized but still critically ill. She was awake but only partially, her eyes struggling to focus as he approached. The doctor explained the situation to her in simple terms, about the compatibility, about Harrison's offer, about the risks involved. Eleanor listened in silence, her eyes never leaving Harrison's face, searching for something in them that only she would know to identify. When the doctor finished, silence stretched between them like a chasm of 24 years of pain and anger. Harrison approached the bed, moving slowly so as not to frighten her, and knelt beside her to be at eye level. He could see the confusion in them, the distrust, the unspoken question of why. Eleanor tried to speak, but her voice was too weak, just a hoarse whisper that barely formed words. Harrison leaned in closer to hear, his ear almost touching her dry lips. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, the single word carrying the weight of their entire history. Harrison pulled back just enough to look into her eyes as he answered. Harrison took a deep breath, gathering the words he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his cell, but which now seemed inadequate in the face of reality. He spoke slowly, clearly, wanting to make sure Eleanor understood every word despite her weakened condition. He told her how he had spent every day in prison thinking about his actions. He explained how he had finally understood the monstrosity of what he had done, not just against Isabel, but the destruction of an innocent family to cover up what he had done. Harrison spoke about the nightmares that tormented him, where Josiah confronted him not with anger, but with sadness for his orphaned daughter. Eleanor listened with eyes that gradually filled with tears, not of forgiveness but of emotional exhaustion. Your father died innocent because of me. Let me do one right thing in life, Harrison said with raw simplicity. Eleanor closed her eyes, a single tear running down her pale cheek, and after a long moment she weakly squeezed his hand in agreement. Harrison, doing this for me doesn't erase what you did to my father, but it shows that even bad people can do something good. My father was a kind man. He didn't deserve the end he got. I want you to know that he would probably forgive you, because he had a good heart. So use his forgiveness, not mine, to understand that we reap what we sow in the world and try to be a better person, she said. Preparations for the surgery began immediately, time being crucial given Eleanor's critical condition. Harrison underwent more tests, preoperative preparation, consultations with anesthesiologists concerned about his ability to survive the procedure. He signed form after form, each detailing more terrible risks than the last, but his determination never wavered. He was bathed, shaved, dressed in hospital clothes that made him look even more fragile and old. A nurse inserted an intravenous line into his arm, the small discomfort nothing compared to what was to come. Harrison was placed on a stretcher next to Eleanor's, both being prepared to be taken to the operating room. Eleanor was sedated but still conscious, and her eyes met his across the space between their stretchers. There was no forgiveness in them. Harrison expected none, but there was something like recognition. Recognition that he was doing this not for redemption, which was impossible, but because it was simply the right thing to do. As they were wheeled through the corridors, Harrison muttered a prayer he hadn't said since childhood. If someone has to die today, let it be me, he whispered to the fluorescent hospital ceiling. The doors to the operating room opened before them like the jaws of some medical beast. The last thing Harrison saw before the anesthesia took over was the masked face of the surgeon, kind eyes above the blue fabric promising to do his best. Then came darkness, not the terrifying darkness of death, but something almost peaceful, like finally being able to rest after carrying an impossible weight. In his drug-induced dreams, Harrison saw Josiah in the garden, not the terrified Josiah of his memories, but a calm Josiah, tending to his roses. The man didn't speak, just nodded once before returning to his work, and somehow this simple gesture meant more than any words could. Harrison floated in this strange peace for an indeterminate time, no pain, no guilt, just existence. Occasionally voices penetrated the fog, medical terms, beeping machines, but it all seemed distant and unimportant. At some point, he felt a sharp pain in his side, reminding him that he still had a body, that he was still alive, at least for now. The surgery continued for hours. 2 bodies opened, a vital organ transferred, lives hanging in balance. Pressure dropping, Harrison heard someone say through the fog. He tried to cling to consciousness, not for himself, but to ensure that Eleanor survived. Eleanor woke slowly, as if emerging from a deep, dark ocean, each sense gradually returning to consciousness. First came the sensation of weight in her body, then the dull but bearable pain in her side, and finally the perception of light through her closed eyelids. She tried to open her eyes, blinking several times until she could focus on the white ceiling of the recovery room, the perfectly aligned tiles forming a pattern that her still clouded mind was trying to decipher. A nurse approached immediately, her round maternal face appearing in Eleanor's field of vision, checking monitors and adjusting the intravenous medication. Eleanor tried to speak, but her throat was dry and rough, and the nurse quickly offered her ice chips that melted like small blessings on her parched tongue. The woman smiled, but there was something in her eyes, a shadow of sadness that didn't match the situation of a successful surgery. Eleanor felt her heart quicken slightly, the monitors capturing her growing anxiety as she tried to understand what was wrong. "The surgery was a success, dear. Your new kidney is functioning perfectly," said the nurse in a soft voice. Eleanor nodded weakly, but the question in her eyes was clear. And Harrison? The silence that followed Eleanor's unspoken question was more eloquent than any words could be. The nurse looked away for a moment, unnecessarily adjusting the sheet over Eleanor, her nervous movements revealing the weight of the news she needed to deliver. Eleanor felt a strange mixture of emotions beginning to form in her chest, feelings she couldn't name or organize in her mind, still confused by medications. The doctor entered the room at that moment, the same one who had explained the risks of surgery, his professional face not completely hiding the fatigue and sadness. He approached Eleanor's bed with measured steps, pulling a chair to sit by her side, a gesture that Eleanor recognized as preparation for bad news. The afternoon sunlight came through the window, creating a golden rectangle on the floor that seemed ironically peaceful, given the moment. Eleanor took a deep breath, the movement causing a twinge of pain in her operated side, and prepared herself to hear what she already suspected. "Mrs. Eleanor, I need to tell you about Mr. Harrison," the doctor began with a gentle but firm voice. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength she didn't know she still had. The doctor explained with clinical but compassionate care that Harrison had not survived. Eleanor heard each word as if they came from far away, her mind processing the information in layers. The doctor continued explaining that Harrison had remained stable long enough for the transplant to be successfully completed, that her kidney was functioning perfectly, that he had essentially given his life to save hers. Eleanor felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She didn't know if from sadness, relief, guilt, or perhaps all these emotions mixed in an impossible cocktail to digest. The doctor gently took her hand, a human gesture that broke the professional barrier for a moment. "He was at peace in the end, Mrs. Eleanor. The last words we could understand were about ensuring that you survived," the doctor said softly. Eleanor nodded, unable to form words, processing the cruel and perhaps poetic irony of the entire situation. 6 weeks had passed since the surgery, and Eleanor walked through the corridors of Hope Home, an institution for orphaned children that she had carefully researched in recent weeks. The building was old but well maintained, with walls painted in soft shades of blue and yellow, children's drawings coloring the corridors, and the constant sound of children's voices echoing through the spaces. Eleanor carried a folder with all the necessary documents for the donation she was about to make, her heart light for the first time in decades. The director of the institution, a gray-haired lady with a warm smile, walked beside her, explaining about the 120 children who lived there, their stories, their needs, their dreams. Eleanor listened attentively, observing the improvised classrooms, the dining hall with worn but clean tables, the playground that clearly needed repairs. Each detail confirmed that she had made the right choice about where the fortune she had inherited could make the biggest difference. The smell of home-cooked food came from the kitchen, reminding Eleanor of the few happy moments she had had in the orphanages of her own childhood. "We do the best we can with what we have," said the director with evident pride. Eleanor smiled, knowing that in a few minutes everything would change for those children. In the director's office, Eleanor signed the final documents that transferred the entire fortune to the institution, creating a perpetual fund that would guarantee education, food, and medical care for generations of orphaned children. The director had to sit down when she saw the amount, her hands trembling as she held the paper, tears streaming down her face, wrinkled by years of worry and dedication. Eleanor felt strangely calm, as if each signature was washing years of pain and anger from her soul. She had decided to keep only enough for a simple and dignified life, refusing to be corrupted by wealth like so many before her. The director tried to speak several times, but emotion prevented her, until she finally managed to stand up and embrace Eleanor with maternal strength. The hug caught Eleanor by surprise. She hadn't been hugged like that since Josiah had died, and for a moment she allowed herself to be just a woman receiving human comfort. Through the window, Eleanor could see the children playing in the courtyard, completely unaware that their lives had just changed drastically. "You have saved all these children," whispered the director, still embracing her. Eleanor gently pulled away, wiping away a tear of her own that had escaped. Eleanor was preparing to leave when the director insisted that she meet some of the children. Eleanor hesitated, not feeling comfortable with the title of benefactor or the attention that would come with it, but something in the woman's urgency made her agree. They went first to the dining hall, where a group of children was doing art activities, their faces concentrated as they drew with worn-out colored pencils and recycled paper. Eleanor observed from the threshold, noticing how each child had their own way of holding the pencil, their own vision of the world expressed in colors and shapes. One girl in particular caught her attention, sitting alone in a corner, methodically drawing what appeared to be a garden full of flowers. Eleanor approached slowly, not wanting to startle the child who seemed completely absorbed in her work. The girl must have been 6 or 7 years old, the same age Eleanor was when she lost everything. With brown hair tied in 2 messy braids and a simple dress that had been mended several times. "What a beautiful garden you're drawing," Eleanor said gently as she knelt beside the child. The girl looked up, revealing brown irises that contained a sadness too deep for someone so young. The girl observed Eleanor for long seconds before returning her attention to the drawing, adding more details to the petals of a yellow rose that occupied the center of the page. Eleanor noticed that the drawing was surprisingly detailed for such a young child. Each flower had distinct characteristics, as if the girl had observed them carefully at some point. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but full of non-verbal communication that Eleanor recognized from her own years of chosen muteness. The director approached, keeping a respectful distance, but observing the interaction with interest. Eleanor picked up a green-colored pencil and began adding leaves to the girl's garden, working silently beside her. The girl watched Eleanor's movements for a moment, then returned to her own drawing, but there was a small change in her posture, a silent acceptance of the strange woman's presence. After a few minutes of drawing together, the girl finally broke the silence. "My father liked gardens too," she said in a soft but clear voice. Eleanor stopped drawing, her heart tightening with the recognition of the pain in the child's voice. Eleanor gently placed the pencil on the table and turned her body completely to face the girl, who had now stopped drawing and was staring fixedly at the paper as if she could find her father among the drawn flowers. Without thinking, Eleanor extended her hand and gently touched the girl's shoulder, who initially shrank but then relaxed under the gentle touch. The other children continued their activities around them, but it was as if Eleanor and the girl were in a bubble, separate from the rest of the world. The director had discreetly moved away, understanding that something important was happening between the two. Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering courage to share something she had kept for so long, something that could create a connection with this child who clearly needed understanding. The girl looked up again, and Eleanor saw in her eyes not only sadness but also a shy curiosity, a fragile hope that someone could understand her pain. "My father loved gardens too. He tended to the most beautiful flowers I've ever seen," Eleanor said softly. The girl leaned slightly toward Eleanor, like a plant seeking the sun, her eyes lighting up with the recognition of a kindred spirit. The girl remained silent for a moment, processing Eleanor's words, then began to speak with an urgency that suggested she had kept these words for a long time. "My father worked in construction, but he always came home and went straight to our little garden. He said the flowers took his tiredness away. He had a yellow rosebush that was his favorite. He talked to it every day," said the girl, her words coming out in a rapid flow. Eleanor listened to each word with complete attention, recognizing in every detail the love between father and daughter that had been cut short too soon. The girl continued, now looking directly at Eleanor, as if she had found someone who could finally understand. "He sang a song about a little bird when he watered the plants. He promised that when I grew up we would have a house with a huge garden full of all the flowers in the world," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. Eleanor held the girl's small hands in hers, feeling the delicate fingers stained with colored pencil. "What was his name?" Eleanor asked gently. The girl took a deep breath before answering, as if saying the name aloud could bring him back or make his absence more real. "His name was Pedro. He died 3 months ago in an accident at the construction site where he worked. A beam fell. I was at school. I couldn't say goodbye," said the girl, tears finally overflowing from her eyes. Eleanor pulled her into a hug, letting her cry against her shoulder, feeling the small body shake with sobs that came from the depths of her soul. It was the hug that Eleanor wished she had received at the same age, the comfort she had sought but never found. The girl clung to Eleanor as if she were an anchor in a sea of sadness, her little hands gripping the fabric of Eleanor's blouse. "He always said I was the most beautiful flower in his garden. He said my name was perfect because I was like a flower," sobbed the girl. Eleanor stroked the child's brown hair, her own tears falling silently as she allowed herself to feel not only this child's pain, but her own pain long kept inside. "What's your name, dear?" Eleanor asked softly when the sobs began to subside. The girl pulled away slightly, wiping her face with the backs of her small hands. "My name is Rose because my daddy loved flowers," answered the girl with a small, sad smile. Eleanor took a handkerchief from her pocket and gently wiped Rose's face, amazed at the coincidence, as if Josiah was somehow orchestrating this meeting. Rose returned the gesture with a shy but genuine smile, the first that Eleanor had seen since approaching her. Around them, the other children had begun to prepare for lunch, putting away their drawing materials, but Rose seemed reluctant to leave Eleanor's side. The director returned, observing the scene with experienced eyes that had seen many connections form over the years, but rarely one so immediate and profound. Eleanor surprised herself by asking permission to have lunch with the children, something taking shape in her heart that she couldn't yet fully name. "Can you sit next to me at lunch? I never have anyone to talk to," Rose asked hopefully. Eleanor nodded, taking the small hand that Rose offered, letting herself be guided to the cafeteria. During the simple but nutritious lunch, Rose transformed from a quiet, withdrawn child into an animated chatterbox, telling Eleanor about her life in the orphanage, about the other children, about her classes. "The teacher says I draw very well, but I only know how to draw flowers. Do you think it's wrong to only know how to draw one thing?" asked Rose between forkfuls of rice and beans. Eleanor smiled, remembering how she herself had focused obsessively on a single thing for so many years, although her obsession had been much darker. "I think when we draw what we love, it always turns out beautiful. And you can learn to draw other things when you want to," Eleanor replied. Rose seemed to consider this seriously, then nodded as if Eleanor had solved a great dilemma. Other children at the table began to join the conversation, curious about the visitor who was having lunch with them. Rose seemed proud to have Eleanor by her side, occasionally touching her arm as if to confirm she was still there. "Will you come back to visit me?" Rose suddenly asked, her voice laden with hope and fear. Eleanor looked into those brown eyes full of need and knew that her life had changed irrevocably in that moment. After lunch, Rose insisted on showing Eleanor the entire orphanage, holding her hand firmly as she guided her through the corridors. "This is where we sleep. There are 8 girls in my room. My bed is that one in the corner, near the window. Sometimes I look at the stars and talk to Daddy," explained Rose as she showed the simple but clean dormitory. Eleanor saw the drawings pinned to the wall beside Rose's bed, all depicting gardens in different stages of bloom, some with figures that clearly represented Rose and her father together. Rose took a specific drawing and showed it to Eleanor with special care, as if it were her most precious possession. It was a garden full of yellow flowers, with 2 figures holding hands in the center, the sun shining brightly above them. "I dreamed about this last week. I dreamed that Daddy came back and we took care of a huge garden together. When I woke up, I drew it so I wouldn't forget," Rose said in a small voice. Eleanor held the drawing with reverence, understanding the weight of unfulfilled dreams, of hopes that persist even when reality denies them. "It's a beautiful drawing, Rose. Your father would be very proud," said Eleanor, returning the drawing. Rose hugged it to her chest before carefully placing it back in its special place. Eleanor spent the rest of the afternoon with Rose and the other children, participating in activities, helping with homework, reading stories to the younger ones. Rose never strayed far, always ensuring that Eleanor was nearby, as if fearing she might disappear if she lost sight of her. During a music activity, where the children were singing nursery songs, Rose pulled Eleanor's sleeve and whispered in her ear, "Something tells me you know the little bird song. My father always sang it to me. Can you sing it too?" she asked hopefully. Eleanor felt tears building in her eyes, then began to hum softly the same melody that Josiah sang to her every day. That seemed to be a sign that her father was there with them somehow. Rose's eyes widened in surprise and joy when she realized that Eleanor knew how to sing the song. "It's similar to what my father sang, just a few different notes," she exclaimed, and began to sing her version. The two melodies intertwined, creating an unexpected harmony that made other children stop to listen. "Can we sing together?" asked Rose. Eleanor nodded, and together they sang. Two versions of a song about hope and freedom, about little birds that fly but always come back home. When the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink through the orphanage windows, Eleanor knew she needed to make a decision. Rose was sitting beside her on a bench in the orphanage's small garden, her feet swinging without touching the ground, talking about what her perfect imaginary garden would be like. It would have roses of all colors, and a pond with golden fish and a big tree to make shade. And it would have a swing because Daddy always promised to make me a swing, Rose described with shining eyes. Eleanor listened to every word, her heart opening in a way she thought no longer possible. She had spent so much time focused on pain and vengeance that she had forgotten she could still feel love, still want to protect and care for someone. "Rose, would you like to have a real garden, a place where you could plant real flowers?" Eleanor asked carefully. Rose stopped swinging her legs and looked at Eleanor with an expression of cautious hope, as if not daring to believe what was being suggested. "Do you know a place like that?" asked Rose in a low voice. Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing she was about to change two lives forever. "Rose, I have a house with a big garden. It's empty now, waiting for someone who loves flowers to take care of it. Would you like to come live with me and take care of that garden?" asked Eleanor, her heart beating strongly as she waited for the answer. Rose became completely still, her wide eyes processing the words she had heard. For a terrible moment, Eleanor feared she had been too hasty, had frightened the child with her sudden proposal. Then Rose threw herself into Eleanor's arms with such force that she almost knocked them off the bench. "You want to be my mother?" "Really, it's not just a dream?" asked Rose, her voice muffled against Eleanor's shoulder. Eleanor hugged her tightly, feeling tears flow freely down her face. "If you'll have me, yes." "I very much want to be your mother," Eleanor replied with a choked voice. Rose pulled back just enough to look at Eleanor's face, her little eyes searching for any sign that this might be a cruel joke. "Do you promise?" "Promise you won't send me back if I do something wrong?" asked Rose with painful vulnerability. Eleanor held Rose's little face between her hands and looked directly into her eyes. "I promise, Rose. I promise I'll never abandon you, never return you, never leave you alone. We'll tend the garden together, plant all the flowers you want, and I'll sing the little bird song with you every night," Eleanor solemnly promised. The next 3 months passed in a routine of daily visits, endless paperwork, and preparing the house to receive Rose. Eleanor transformed one of the bedrooms into a perfect space for a child who loved drawing and dreaming of gardens. She painted the walls a soft yellow, bought new furniture, filled the shelves with books about flowers and gardening, and most importantly, began preparing the actual garden. She planted rose bushes of every color she could find, created beds for different flowers, and even installed a small fountain that reminded her of the one she played in as a child. Rose followed each progress with growing enthusiasm, making drawings of how each part of the garden would look, planning where each plant would go. "When I come home, can we plant sunflowers here?" Rose would ask, pointing to a corner of the garden in the drawing. Eleanor always agreed, amazed at how Rose already called that place home, even before moving in. The other children at the orphanage were happy for Rose, although some were sad to lose her. "You can visit me in my garden when I have my home," Rose promised her friends. Eleanor made sure to assure the director that Rose could maintain contact with her friends from the orphanage. Finally, after 3 months that felt like 3 years, the day arrived when Rose would officially become Eleanor's daughter. Rose woke before dawn that day, carefully arranged her few belongings in the small suitcase that Eleanor had bought for her, and wore the new yellow flowered dress she had chosen especially for the occasion. Eleanor arrived at the orphanage with her heart racing, carrying a bouquet of flowers from what would be Rose's garden. When Rose saw her, she ran into her arms with a cry of joy that echoed through the corridors. "Mommy, you came!" "Today I'm going home," Rose exclaimed, the word mommy coming out naturally as if it had always been that way. Eleanor held her in her arms, spinning her in the air while Rose laughed, a sound that was music to Eleanor's ears. The goodbyes at the orphanage were emotional, with hugs, tears, and promises of visits. The director embraced them both for a long time. "You two have saved each other," she whispered to Eleanor. Eleanor nodded, understanding the profound truth in those simple words. The journey home was filled with Rose's animated conversation, her excitement overflowing in questions and observations about everything she saw. "Is that our street? Are those our neighbors? Look, there's a dog there. Can we have a dog too?" Rose asked in rapid succession. Eleanor answered each question with patience and joy, amazed at Rose's ability to find magic in everyday things. When they arrived home and Rose saw the garden for the first time, she was absolutely silent for several seconds, her wide eyes trying to absorb everything. Then, with a cry of joy, she ran through the garden, touching each flower, smelling each rose, spinning with open arms in the middle of the lawn. "It's more beautiful than my drawings. Daddy would be so happy to see this," exclaimed Rose. Eleanor smiled, knowing that Josiah would also be happy to see the garden alive again, cared for with love. "Can we plant a special rose for my father, and one for yours?" Rose suddenly asked. Eleanor nodded, moved by the child's sensitivity. Eleanor showed Rose her new room, and the girl stood at the door, her eyes filling with tears as she absorbed every detail. The canopy bed decorated with hand-painted flowers, the desk full of new art supplies, the shelves with books, and especially the large window with a perfect view of the garden. "Is all this really mine?" asked Rose in a small voice, as if she still couldn't believe it. Eleanor knelt beside her and hugged her gently. "All yours, my love. This is your room, your home, your garden." "Our home," said Eleanor. Rose explored every corner of the room, opening drawers, testing the softness of the bed, leafing through books, until she stopped in front of an empty picture frame on the bedside table. "Can I put a picture of me with Daddy here?" she asked timidly. Eleanor agreed immediately, and Rose ran to her suitcase, taking out a wrinkled photo of her with Pedro in front of the small garden of her old home. Eleanor helped put the photo in the frame, and Rose carefully positioned it where she could see it from the bed. "Now Daddy can see that I'm well," said Rose with a smile. Eleanor felt her heart tighten and expand at the same time. Their first dinner together at home was simple but special. Eleanor had prepared Rose's favorite food, macaroni and cheese, and they made a salad together with vegetables that Eleanor had started growing in the garden. Rose chatted happily about all the plans she had for the garden, about the flowers she wanted to plant, about where the swing that Eleanor had promised to install would be. "Can we make a special corner for butterflies?" "Dad said butterflies bring messages from heaven," Rose asked between bites. Eleanor agreed, already mentally planning which plants would attract more butterflies. After dinner, they washed the dishes together, Rose on a small stool to reach the sink, singing the little bird song while drying the dishes with concentrated care. Eleanor watched her, amazed at how the house that had been the scene of so much pain and revenge now echoed with a child's laughter. When Rose yawned, Eleanor took her to bathe and prepare for sleep. Rose put on the sunflower pajamas that Eleanor had bought and brushed her teeth with the new toothbrush that had a ladybug design. "Mum, will you stay with me until I fall asleep?" asked Rose, already in bed. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and began to softly sing the little bird song. Rose held Eleanor's hand, who watched her. She thought of Josiah, how proud he would be to see her caring for another orphaned child, transforming her pain into love. Together they built a life filled with the love that both had lost so tragically. Eleanor, who had spent 24 years nurturing her thirst for revenge, discovered that a child's love had the power to heal wounds that seemed incurable. Rose, who had lost her father, and with him her cheerful voice, found in Eleanor not just a mother, but someone who understood her pain and transformed it into hope. Where there was once hatred, love now grew. Where there was silence of pain, songs about free little birds now echoed. The two orphans saved each other, proving that even from the most barren and wounded soils, the most beautiful gardens can sprout. Eleanor had finally understood what Josiah always knew, that cultivating love will always be worth more than harvesting revenge. "Thank you for choosing me, Mum," Rose whispered every night before sleeping. And Eleanor always answered the same thing, with her heart overflowing with gratitude. Thank you for saving me, my flower. Now, tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll wait for you there.